Welcome to this EMS web training session. During this session, we're going to discuss the finding closure review process. So this will be the entire process once a finding has been created and finalized. And then we'll go through the process to close out that finding. So the finding will will first be finalized to get it out of draft status, then assigned, resolved, submitted for formal review, and closed. And that's the process for when a finding has to go through formal review. If there is no formal review required, then it gets a lot simpler. And then we'll go through that case as well. But essentially, it still goes through assigned and resolved, but then it goes straight through to closed. And the installation personnel are able to go through the entire process by themselves. When you go through the formal review, some of the steps have to be taken by the lead auditor or the closure review POC. Okay, so let's walk through on an example finding all of the steps to close out a finding under a formal review process. So here we are looking at a finding that has been previously created. A POAM has also been created for this finding. And once it shows up, then I can show you that that it has the milestones created, and it's still in a preliminary state. The status is POAM under development, and none of the milestones have any progress to it yet. So if we take a look at the finding, this finding has been finalized, and the audit inspection team is typically the personnel that would finalize these draft findings. So once it becomes finalized, the audit inspection personnel will typically assign this finding to the installation personnel. So they will have this assign button available to them. And there are a couple of really important things that occur during this assign form. One is that it defines who the closure review POC is. In this case, this value was pre-populated because it was specified in the inspection that this finding belonged to. But whoever is filling out this form can change the closure review POC. So if you're the lead auditor or the existing closure review POC, you can change and update the closure review POC field. If you are a installation personnel or someone who does not belong to that inspection or audit, then you will not be able to update the closure review POC field. So you have a target date for this. So we're going to say that they're going to try and resolve it by the end of the year. You can identify a risk, and we'll talk more about that later in a separate training session. There is a responsible party field that you can fill out, and that defines what party is responsible for closing out the finding In other words, the ones that are capable of performing the actions required to resolve this finding. The responsible party drop-down list is a unique one to each installation, and they can fill out that responsible party table underneath EMS data under the EMS tab under the responsible party selection. We also have a funding entity, which is the party that is responsible for providing funding for it. And so that runs off of the same table as the responsible party. You can notify additional personnel that this finding has been assigned, and it will also be automatically emailed to the POCs of the responsible party. The biggest, most important ones are defining if a formal review and a POAM is required in order to close out this finding. So I'm going to check yes on both of these. So that means that the interaction with the lead auditor and the closure review POC is going to be required in order to close out this finding. If these are both unchecked, then whoever is assigned this finding at the installation level or any of the installation personnel that have access to the audit inspections or the finding tab will be able to resolve and close out the finding by themselves without any outside review or assistance. So once the finding is assigned, and this is taking a little while for EMS Web to go through, so we'll just be patient. But once the finding has been resolved, then the finding then goes to the installation personnel to resolve. So they're the ones that should make sure that the POAM is created and up to date as desired. And then they need to go through and resolve this finding. So in order to resolve this finding, and note that the assign button is gone for this menu, and there's only delete and edit. And these buttons are typically only available to the lead auditor and the closure review POC. For the typical installation POC, they will not be available. So in order to get the resolve button available for the installation to use, they first have to complete their POAM. So there are two steps in order to complete your POAM. One is to get your POAM approved by the lead auditor or the closure review POC. And so what you would do is you would create your POAM, set it up, make sure all of the milestones are set up correctly, and if necessary, fill out the corrective and preventive actions. Once you have the POAM to the point where you think it is the proper way to resolve this finding, then you change the status to ready for review. So the installation personnel will have the choices of POAM under development and POAM ready for review. And then they would save that POAM. So when you save a POAM under the ready for review status, that will fire off an automated email that goes to the lead auditor and the closure review POC. And that will indicate that to them that this POAM is ready for review. Here's a link to the POAM. Please go ahead and review it. And then the lead auditor or the closure review POC will have two options. They can say, yes, this POAM is approved, or they might say, there are still some issues with the POAM. Please correct it and resubmit. So here I'll log into and edit the POAM and act as if I'm the lead auditor. And if I say POAM issue is reviewed and issues still exist, then the installation personnel will have to revise the POAM and then set it back to a status of ready for review. And then that cycle continues until the lead auditor says, okay, the POAM is approved. So once the POAM is approved, if I go back to the finding, I can see that the finding status has already been assigned. The POAM has been approved on this date. And you can see under the history, this is the date that the POAM got set to ready for review and who did it, and then when the POAM was approved and who did it. And then notice under each step of the way, we have the action, POC, and instructions. And so this indicates, for this step in the finding process, this is who should do the next step. And so if you read these instructions, it says, once the POAM is completed, all milestones set to 100%, then the assigned POC can use the resolve button and define the root cause code. So that means we need to go back to the POAM and make sure that all of the milestones are completed. Okay, so you'll see that on this milestone table, we've tried to make it easy to update the progress for the milestones. So we've created a special table with these green fields. And that indicates that you can click into it, change the progress percentage, and click into the next box, change that one, and so on. And then the next time you visit the page or refresh it, you'll see that the progress has been completed, has been updated to 83%. And that's just the simple average of the three progress percentages for the milestones. And the intent is that over time, as all of the milestones get completed, then eventually each one of these will be at 100%. Okay, and then when you refresh that POAM page, you'll see that the progress does indeed change to 100%. The status changes to POAM approved, and that the POAM is completed on this date and time. If we go back to the finding, we can see under the status history, it has also been updated as appropriate. So the status has changed to POAM approved on this date. And now, as the installation POC, I can see that there's now a resolve button available. So I would go ahead and click the resolve. And this is going to ask me some additional information. So if I had put in a CAPA information in the POAM, it would be reflected here. So here's a chance to update the corrective and preventive action. And then the other thing it's going to ask is if I agree with the ISO 14000 reference and what the installation believes is the root cause code. So you don't have to agree with what the auditors said was the root cause code. And under the process of the POAM and completing all of the milestones, you might find out under a deeper look that the root cause code was something different. So the root cause code is a mandatory field for the resolution. And then you can go ahead and check what the root cause code is. So the arrows on the side of each category for the root cause code indicates that there are subcategories. And then you can select that and click on one of the subcategories. So then once you fill that out, you can save it, and then the installation has finished the resolve situation. So then the status history gets updated again. It's past the open resolve stage, and the action PLC instructions gets updated. So now it says that the assigned POC should submit for formal review. Okay, so this is saying this is the last chance for the installation PLC to make any changes to the finding information or to the POAM. And they're essentially saying, okay, everything has been done and completed for this finding to be resolved. So they click on submit for a formal review, and then that finishes that stage. So now we can see it's pending formal review under the status history. And now you can see the action POC instructions say that the closure review POC and the lead auditor, in this case both of them are the same person, the Atlantis auditor, which is the account that I'm using, should review and use the formal review button to close the finding or kick it back to the installation. So when you submit for formal review, again, that kicks off an automated email going to the closure review POC and the lead auditor, indicating that the finding is ready to be closed. It provides the lead auditor and closure review POC a URL to go directly to this finding. And so then they can do that by clicking on formal review. So when they do that, they have two choices. They can say that the finding can be closed or this finding wasn't properly resolved. So in this case, I'm going to say the finding wasn't properly resolved, and I'm going to say action X needs to be taken before this finding can be resolved. Okay, so the idea is that the lead auditor or closure review POC clearly writes down what needs to be remediated before the finding can be resolved. And so then the finding POC gets notified via email, and you can see that under the status history now that the lead auditor reopened it, and then here is the guidance text for what needs to happen by the installation personnel. So we'll pretend that the installation personnel took the steps as indicated in this message, and then they can resolve again. And click Save. And then submit for formal review again. Okay, then each step again gets logged under the status history. And then let's say the lead auditor goes in And this time they say, okay, I concur. Finding is now ready to be closed. And then they save it with this finding can be closed marked, and then boom, the finding has finally been closed. Okay, then we have the status history and everything else. And so that's all of the steps for a when you go through the formal review. When you do not go through a formal review, then it is much, much simpler. Then once the finding is assigned and no formal review is marked, then the finding POC can create a POAM if it was marked that a POAM is required. If the POAM was not required, then they don't have to create a POAM, and they can just resolve and immediately close it and just mark down exactly what steps were taken. If a POAM was required, then they have to create the POAM and then just make sure all milestones that are at 100%, and then they'll be able to resolve and close the finding out by themselves. So if a formal review isn't necessary, then the closure process is much, much simpler.